Good morning and welcome to 2061st meeting of the Permanent Council. The agenda for this meeting has been issued as a document PC.gal/114/15 revision 1 dated 30th June. And it's on the table in front of you. Are there any comments on the draft agenda? I believe I see that there is none. Before we start our proceedings for this morning, I would like to inform the Permanent Council that the Chairmanship has invited Mr. Childeric Schafel, the head of the Council of Europe office in Vienna, in line with the relevant provisions of the OSCE rules of procedure. I would like also to inform you that the representatives of media have been invited to stay in the room during the address of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany. As it is already a tradition, every year in July we have opportunity to welcome the incoming chairperson in office and to hear the priorities of the future chairmanship. This year we have a pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany, His Excellency Dr. Frank-Walter Steinmeier, to the Permanent Council. Excellency, it is a pleasure to have you today here at the PC meeting to hear the priorities of your future chairmanship. Germany will take over the helm of the OSCE in a challenging time for our organization. It is facing one of the biggest crises in its history. Of course, the crisis in and around Ukraine will still dominate the agenda of the OSCE. Having said that, Mr. Minister, I would like to assure you on behalf of Serbian chairmanship that we stand ready to offer strong support for your chairmanship during next year as a member of Troika. During this year, we have developed an excellent cooperation within Troika together with our Swiss colleagues, format on different levels, and we hope that we will continue to work together in the course of the next year. Without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to His Excellency, the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany. Mr. Steinmeier, you have the floor. Thank you.
Herr Vorsitzender,
Chairman, Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to have been invited here to the Permanent Council, not just to have been invited, but also to have the opportunity as future chairman of the OSCE to speak to you today about the security policy situation in the OSCE area. And not just about the situation, but also about the consequences that this situation has for the OSCE, and thus obviously for the German chairmanship in 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, Europe is navigating extremely perilous waters. We must weather storms that come from both the inside and the outside. In the east of our continent, a security policy crisis is raging, undoubtedly the most serious since the end of the Cold War. That is the conflict in Ukraine. At the same time, many other dangerous storms are sweeping through our neighborhood near and far. That is, from Iraq and Syria to the Sahel area. Crises and conflicts so numerous, complex and severe as I have never experienced them in my political career. And I think it will be the same for most of you. Not just I, but hardly anyone here would have imagined such a situation only a few years ago. I say this precisely because this stormy time we are going through is a period of testing for this organization, the OSCE, but not just for this organization, but it's a test for peace in Europe. During this test, we have decided to take on responsibility. To stay with the maritime terminology, we'll take the helm of this organization in 2016. and in so doing we want to help it navigate these stormy seas. You all know that in a situation like this, in such troubled waters, you cannot easily promise a successful crossing. And I know, and the German federal government knows, that this will not be a fair weather excursion. Nor can I tell you whether we will arrive in a safe port by the end of next year. But we all know how much is at stake in Europe. Precisely we Germans know how much we owe this institution and the CSCE process. First of all, on the path to détente between East and West, then to ending the Cold War, and finally to the reunification of our country. Exactly 40 years ago, the Helsinki Final Act was signed, and the Finnish President Urho Kekkonen articulated his hopes for the future. If I can quote him briefly from a speech at the time, he said he hoped that a new era in our mutual relations was dawning, and that we have set out on a journey through détente to stability and enduring peace. We've come a long way on this journey. The current storm, that in Ukraine, cannot and should not end the journey. We must not allow all that we have built up in the OSCE over the decades, that is, the vision of a peaceful order in Europe that rests on dialogue, trust and security, to be torn down. Dialogue, trust and security. These are the principles that will orient our compass when in 2016 we take the helm of the OSCE. The first pillar you've just heard is dialogue. Precisely in the experience of Germany, the CSCE process was always a process of dialogue, even across the deepest political and ideological divides of the Cold War. This dialogue was always laborious and lengthy, but in the end it made a vital contribution to détente between East and West. I say that because I'm convinced that today too, in this severe crisis in and around Ukraine, we need this kind of dialogue, and I'm convinced that the OSCE must be the platform for this dialogue. Over the decades, the OSCE has grown as a common organization, is rooted in mutually agreed basic principles, and it possesses proven instruments of dialogue. All of these things matter today, for I remain certain that there can be no military solution to the Ukraine conflict. The solution must be political, and this moment of testing, which I mentioned before, is at the same time a moment of diplomacy and dialogue. In the package of measures adopted in Minsk, we agreed on a roadmap that outlines the political path out of the conflict. It sets out a political path which, of course, those in bearing political responsibility must go down. And as I've said in interviews and press conferences often enough in Germany, the way that we have sketched out in Minsk is not perfect. But for the time being, it's the only one we have. And the OSCE has a vital role to play in implementing it. But primarily, all the conflict parties must fulfill, they must have the willingness to fulfill their obligations they entered into and to continue to do so every day and every week. I could put it another way, dear colleagues. Without a political solution to the Ukraine conflict, it's hardly likely that we will find our way back onto the path towards a shared understanding of our common future and the principles of our coexistence. And it's quite clear to all of us that our respective understanding of these things are currently far apart. That's why the dialogue which I'm talking about, which I still think is necessary, will not be a fair weather dialogue. It will be highly contentious. But even if it's contentious, it's very important, and it's all the more important that we talk to one another about our different perceptions, about the ways we feel threatened, and about our conflicting interests. We can and must talk about all of these things as long as we speak with and not past one another. Excellencies, there's another aspect which I think is very important when we talk about dialogue. This is not just a dialogue among governments, but rather a dialogue among people. Just now, when political alienation has increased so much in the OSCE area, civil society connections have become all the more important. This human dimension is laid out in the Helsinki Final Act, and we want to try to strengthen this human dimension during our chairmanship. I'm speaking here, for example, of youth exchanges. We'd like to continue the work of Switzerland and Serbia in this area. We also, like the Swiss and Serbian chairmanships before us, want to incorporate civil society more extensively into the discussion among states within the OSCE. I'm speaking, secondly, about freedom of the press and freedom of expression, of the independence of the media. And to be very precisely about it, safety of journalists. Times of conflict are, unfortunately, also times of propaganda and of distorted images. The OSCE should set common standards against these things. I'm speaking, thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, about the protection of minorities. Today, Europe in the East and in the West is a very diverse continent. Minorities should and must be protected in modern states so that these bring societies together rather than dividing them. And we simply must not allow minorities to be instrumentalized. This also means that we must combat every form of political extremism, intolerance and discrimination. This concern will also shape the German chairmanship. As many of you know, we take very seriously the issue of anti-Semitism. We'd like to build on the Berlin conferences, which some or others of you may remember, from 2004 and 2014. The terrible attacks in Paris, Brussels and Copenhagen have shown us that anti-Semitism remains a real and dangerous threat. Perhaps it's even become even more so. A threat not just to our Jewish citizens, but also to our societies as a whole. Hence, the struggle against anti-Semitism must remain our shared concern. One OSCE thematic area that the German chairmanship would also like to highlight is strengthening the rights of women. Ladies and gentlemen, granting fundamental civil liberties guarantees peace and stability, I'm convinced. Not just because free and democratic societies are better protected from the virus of extremism, radicalization and terrorism, but also because we as governments, and I mean all the governments that are gathered in this organization, are, at the end of the day, dependent on the trust of our citizens. Only a government that protects basic rights has earned the trust of its people. So I would like us in OSCE circles to engage in serious dialogue about how we can better implement, we can strengthen the corresponding OSCE institutions. I'm thinking here of the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Precisely, electoral monitoring by ODIHR are a hallmark of the OSCE, which has set standards worldwide and which enjoy great respect. And I'm thinking of the High Commissioner on National Minorities and the Representative on Freedom of the Media. We're building on their excellent work, and we'll work together closely with them. Ladies and gentlemen, the path of dialogue leads me to the next pillar of our work in the OSCE, trust. Let's not deceive ourselves. In the past year and a half, not only has a highly dangerous threat to our European security been ignited, but a tremendous amount of trust has been lost. I don't think I need to tell you this. You, who meet here regularly around this table here in Vienna, probably sense this all the more acutely than members of government elsewhere in other countries. And when we say this, we need to be clear about why there has been this loss of trust. Of course, Russia's annexation of Crimea violated international law and a fundamental principle of the Europe's peace order, the inviolability of borders, and thereby called Europe's security into question. The attempt to change European borders unilaterally without any regard for national sovereignty is unacceptable and cannot be a form of behavior that occurs among states in a security community. And, ladies and gentlemen, what makes things all the worst? Trust is quickly destroyed, but it usually is only very slowly rebuilt. For me, it's a rule of thumb of foreign and security policy that you can trigger a conflict in 14 days. But it can take 14 years or longer to truly resolve it. This makes it all the more important that we get started now. Let us strengthen existing elements of confidence building rather than dismantling them further. And we should even attempt to develop them further, even though the end of 2016 will not mark the end of this work. Firstly, we need to return to the fundamental principles of cooperative security. Precisely now, when the Ukraine crisis has caused threatening reflexes from the Cold War to reawaken, I think it essential to strengthen the arms control regimes. Confidence and security building measures, regular military contacts, and exchange of military and political experts are all an essential part of this concept of cooperative security, and dialogue on these topics precisely in the OSCE must not be demolished. If other organizations don't pursue this dialogue. Secondly, confidence is only created when we face our common threats together. We needn't think far outside the box of the OSCE to recognize such threats. International terrorism, radicalization, cross-border drug trafficking, and new risks in cyberspace are all among them. In all of these areas, we could well do with more cooperation, not less. A great deal of groundwork has been done in the OSCE by Serbia, by Switzerland, and also by other countries before us, and we want to build on it. In the area of transnational threats, we want to work together more closely with partner countries. And we hope that our conference with the Mediterranean partners in October in Jordan will, hopefully, provide fresh impetus for this. And I hope that the negotiations running in parallel about the end of the nuclear conflict with Iran may make a contribution for new discussions about a security architecture in the Middle East. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, economic exchange can strengthen confidence in the long term. That's why it's absolutely right for the OSCE as a security organization to engage more with the connection between economic and security policy issues. For example, connectivity is one of the necessary keywords here. Infrastructure, transportation routes, border and customs procedures are all vital areas for investment, and at the end of the day, hence for jobs. But also, and this is important to me, important for common security. Promotion of good governance also fits into this area, improving conditions for investment, combating corruption, minimizing environmental threats, and, highly topical, managing better cross-border migration. All effectively are beneficial both economically and in terms of security policy. The OSCE, that's why I say so here, can serve as a forum for exchange of experience and should, with its broad membership, also advance the dialogue about what economic governance in our shared area would look like that was acceptable to all and beneficial for all in our shared area. And perhaps in this context, it would be helpful to look beyond the borders of the OSCE. Let me move on to the third pillar, and hence to security. It's obvious the storms of the present have shaken even this existential pillar of the OSCE. The crisis in Ukraine has brought armed conflict back to our continent. And in spite of the ceasefire agreement from Minsk, which the OSCE played a considerable role in facilitating, people are still dying. And we still see military actions and too many violations of the ceasefire. So, from my perspective, we have no choice. We must make the pillar of security stronger, firmer, stormproof, precisely in the light of the current conflict. The OSCE is and remains a key instrument of conflict prevention and resolution in Europe. And let me emphasize, this is precisely what the OSCE is currently demonstrating in Ukraine. Let me state this here. The OSCE has proved to be irreplaceable. I prefer not even to think about what the situation could have descended into without the OSCE, without the special monitoring mission, without the courage and dedication of the women and men who are braving the storm in the name of the OSCE. They in Ukraine and all those who are active in crisis regions for the OSCE are rendering an outstanding and invaluable service for the benefit of all of our security. So I think we owe them many thanks. But we should not only give thanks, we also bear responsibility towards these men and women. That is to provide them with the support that they need and deserve to be able to complete their work safely. The OSCE and its institutions need to be in a position to fulfill their mandates in all conflicts and regions. In Ukraine, in the South Caucasus, and still in Moldova. We cannot allow the dangerous tremors that are rippling through the European security order to spread to other regions of our continent. The remaining trouble spots must be resolved on the basis of the agreements that have been entered into. And in so doing, we can use all existing OSCE formats. We should equip the Conflict Prevention Center with more capabilities and resources for early detection and crisis prevention, because precisely these determine the speed and quality of the OSCE's crisis prevention work. We all have an interest in strengthening and not weakening these structures. And if we do so, we ought to draw lessons from the current situation. We ought to take up proposals for improvements. And I think these things will be put to and discussed by the panel of eminent persons. However, such improvements have two conditions. The first is that there be clear political will on the part of all participants around the table. It's essential for all participating states to cooperate with the OSCE institutions and field missions reliably and in a spirit of trust. All of these institutions and missions support and assist us, and we should value their contribution to our common security. Secondly, the second condition, it won't come as a surprise to you, we also need adequate financial resources for the OSCE. I'm aware of the challenges of tight public budgets. But in these stormy times, we must make sure that this organization has security, financial security as well. That's why it's crucial that we have swift adoption of the budget. Ladies and gentlemen, I've mentioned the three pillars with the many building blocks which they are made out of. If we are to make this construction successful, let me point out at the end, each single building block is a great deal of work. The first brick must come before the second. The house is built from the bottom up. Now, I know that some of you have great expectations of the German chairmanship, but these are stormy times, as I said, and the future is uncertain. So let's all be quite clear that it won't work if this is just the chairmanship on its own. Rather, we all need to pull together. And in this exceedingly difficult time, we can probably only move forward step by step, putting one block upon the next. And I think we need to take 4 steps. First and foremost, the OSCE is a complex multilateral organization, and in difficult times it must still be able to function. This is the first step. Let me say once again, this includes having the budget passed. Secondly, the second step is acute crisis management. We want to use the OSCE's set of tools for this, as we're currently doing in Ukraine through the Special Monitoring Mission and the Trilateral Contact Group. If we succeed in this, that is not just in retaining the institutions, but in implementing the Minsk agreements, then, and I'm convinced of this, the OSCE can build or help build the decisive bridges to resolving the conflict. Thirdly, in this address, I've described a number of challenges that go far beyond the acute storm on the horizon. These future challenges also require the OSCE, but that means the OSCE itself as an organization must be put on a more solid footing than it is currently. We've felt this during the crisis in Ukraine. We've spoken about this. We need to have the technical preconditions. They've become all the more difficult. And finally, fourthly, we will adhere to the spirit of Helsinki, to the vision of a Europe of trust and cooperation. And I hope that this common architecture will one day be built on the building blocks of the OSCE. In conclusion, even if this is just a synopsis of a future chairmanship, we don't wish to embellish anything precisely when we talk about the facts. We should point out that we were further ahead in the 40 years history of OSCE. Much has been destroyed. And since we know that rebuilding confidence will be a long process, let me recall the words of Willy Brandt, who said, "Small steps are better than no steps." Willy Brandt was himself a trailblazer for the CSCE. So maybe we should have the courage to take those small steps, even if the greater steps seem further away. And if we take these small steps together, then I can tell you that I look forward to this common path ahead of us. And I'm very pleased that we will be traveling this path together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for your comprehensive, interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And now I would like kindly to ask the representatives of media to leave the hall.